Well, I'm glad that you're here. We've got kind of a choppy schedule with the holidays coming up. This is the second part of a conversation we started a couple of weeks ago about the Bible. We first asked the question, is the Bible true? And we talked about its background. And then tonight we take the second part of that and talk about whether we can trust it. Because the thing about life is you can only live it one time. You can't live your whole life and then go, okay, now that I know how to do it, let me start over. That especially impacted me when our children were born. I couldn't believe that in order to be qualified to take our firstborn child home from the hospital, I had to demonstrate how to strap in a car seat. That was it. And when we got home, put the car in park and shut it off, it's like, so we're parents. There's a human being that's dependent on our guidance. Oh boy. And so I want to explore tonight, is the Bible a guide stone? Is it a compass? Is it something that we can trust? Because we only get to do this one time. So is it accurate? Is it true? Can I trust it? So in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 through 6, if you got your Bibles open tonight, flip over to that passage. And then just stay there in Proverbs. We'll be looking at another piece in just a minute. But in Proverbs chapter 3, the Bible makes a bold claim. It tells us in verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him and He will make your paths straight. Verse 7 especially, to add one more verse, speaks to me when it says, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. I don't know if you've ever experienced being wise in your own eyes, but I have gone through and still struggle with occasional periods of, I already know everything. Does anybody remember those days? That was right before you had kids, if you can't remember. I know everything. This keeps us from being able to learn or to be able to grow. And we're going to explore some of the things about how the Bible addresses this for us. Let's consider, as we talked about last time, that you'll be able to decide for yourself, number one, is the Bible in its original form, is it flawless? Is it inspired? Is it from God? And then number two, is the translation that you have in your hand, is it reliable? That's what we discussed last time. And just to give us a simple response, we talked about where it comes from, how it's translated, how it's been communicated. But here's what makes the Bible unique. This is what we sort of discussed last time. It's unique in its composition. When you think about the number of years that spans from the first book being written to the last book being written, more than 1,500 years, more than 25-something authors, 3 different languages, 3 different continents, the kind of continuity that you have in this book is stunning. The simple illustration we gave last time, if I were to ask you, I probably need to slow down. I'm just excited tonight. I just realized how fast I'm talking. If I were to ask you tonight, or ask us as a group, an essay project, a simple 5-page essay, make it a 3-page essay, and I said, tell me what you think is right about, and then picked a moral issue. Do you suppose that we would have agreement in this room? I don't think we would. Is that fair? And yet we're of the same culture, we're of the same language, we're in the same time, and we would not have agreement in this room. How is it that the Bible, that is spread out over so many different authors, ages, languages, and continents, has such agreement or continuity? The Bible is unique in its circulation. It has been copied and spread more than any other book in history. It's unique in its translation. The Bible's been more translated than any other book. The Bible has been largely responsible for literacy in the modern world. Entire indigenous groups can be discovered. They may not even have a written language, but in order to get the scriptures to them, there will be a study of that language, a grammar that's designed or recorded and in the Bible translated. So the Bible has driven education in our world like nothing else has. The Bible's unique in its durability. It's also been the most outlawed book. Throughout history, there have been kings and emperors and others who have made it illegal, who've made it a capital crime, punishable by death, if you have a copy of this. There's a lot of books I like to read, but how many would you die for? And many folks have for this book. It's unique. And it's unique in its effect on people. It just absolutely messes with you. It challenges your thinking, your vocabulary, the way you do relationships, the way you view life, the way you answer the major questions to life. That just summarizes some of the things we talked about in our last discussion about can we trust the Bible. And so when we think about that, where the Bible's come from, how it's translated, and so on, tonight's these last two pieces. Is the Bible accurate in its claims to science and history? And is it accurate in terms of its prophecy? I mentioned last time there is another religious book you can read, and it claimed that when we would go to the moon, we would find Quakers 9 feet tall that live on the moon. And we've been to the moon, and thus far we haven't found any Quakers. Now, if the Bible has claims like that, prophetic statements that are that false, that's a problem, right? If it claims to be flawless, it claims to be inerrant, then that's a fair question. Now, to be honest, the Bible is not a science book. It's not what it's about. The Bible is about what life is and how to live it. But where it touches on the subject, if it's from God, it ought to be accurate. Does that make sense? So the purpose of the Bible is not a science book, but where it touches on the subject, it should be accurate. And so far, through the historical and archaeological evidence, the Bible has been proven accurate over and over and over. We'll show you that as we develop it. So here's just some things. Let's do some Bible turning. First of all, if you would turn to Proverbs chapter 30. We're going to look at a few verses together. Proverbs chapter 30. This has sort of been the touchstone verse that we've been using each time we've discussed this. For Proverbs 30, verse 5 says, "Every word of God is tested," or some translations say flawless or demonstrated. "He is a shield to those who take refuge in him. Do not add to his words, or he will reprove you, and you will be proved a liar." See, the first claim is that the Word of God is flawless, or is tested, or is trustworthy. If that's true, then that gives us encouragement that the second part is true, that God will be a shield to us, a guide, a protector, that He'll give us a place to stand in the storms of life that will last. So here's some things the Bible references. See if you find this interesting. Turn, if you would, to Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah chapter 40. We'll read in verse 22. Isaiah says, "It is He who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in." I've got a little reference by the word circle in this translation, and in the margin it says, "or sphere." Now, Isaiah was written, just in round numbers, about 750 years before Christ was born. Now, for a long time, we thought the earth was flat. We would draw maps, and when you get to the edge of the map, there'd be dragons there. You go right off the cliff. In fact, there was an Italian fella that got in a boat in about 1492. He sailed the ocean blue. That's the only reason I can remember that date. Because he believed that the world was round. And do you remember what the scientific community, what the culture thought at that claim? That's crazy. But more than 2,200 years earlier, you have this expression. Now, Isaiah is not trying to talk about science, but he is talking about things from God. So if he's going to touch the subject, it ought to be accurate. How is it that Isaiah knew to use this expression, that the world would be a circle or a sphere? How about Jeremiah 33? I think this one's interesting. Jeremiah 33. While you're turning there, how many stars are there? Did you know it's not that long ago that we actually estimated that there would be about 1,100 stars total? When the Hubble Space Telescope was put up, well, and then after it was repaired, it had some alignment issues. They took the Hubble Space Telescope. It had some advantages because it was outside the Earth's atmosphere, so it could see further and with less distortion. They focused it on a blank spot, what was thought at that time to be a blank spot, just a dark spot. And because of its ability to see further and not be troubled by the atmosphere, they found in the dark spot more stars than they could count. Now here's how Jeremiah says it in Jeremiah chapter 33. Let's see, that's in verse Jeremiah 33:22. As the host of heaven cannot be counted, and the sand of the sea cannot be measured, so I will multiply the descendants of David my servant and the Levites who minister to me. Again, Jeremiah's point is not to talk about astrology or astronomy. I always get those two words mixed up. That's quite different. But his reference, when he touches it, yeah, I know, let that soak in for a second. One is your horoscope and the other is science. Anyway, when Jeremiah makes this reference, in his day, even in our own day, till recently, there was a finite or limited number of stars. Why would he say it that way? But he says it just right. Centuries before we would figure that out, before the space telescope would ever be launched. Turn, if you would, to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The Apostle Paul makes an interesting statement as he's talking about life after death and the resurrection and all of those kinds of things. He says in verse 40, this is 1 Corinthians verse 15, verse 40, chapter 15, verse 40. He said, there are also heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is one and the glory of the earthly is another. Then he says this, there is one glory of the sun and another glory of the moon and another glory of the stars, for star differs from star in glory. Now, one of my favorite ancient explanations of the stars, the ancient Hebrews, I'm told, saw the earth as a kettle, kind of as a, what's the name of the little black charcoal kettle that we all grill on? A Weber, thank you. Like a little Weber. And it was a half sphere, and the earth was the flat part, and then there was a lid on it, and underneath that lid is where the storms were, the birds flew, and all that. But what the stars were was holes poked in the lid, and that was the glory of God shining through the lid. Personally, I think that's sort of a neat way to think about it, but of course it's entirely unscientific, right? Well, if that's what the Hebrews thought, and that was a fairly common thing, you'd think we would find that in the writings. But what we get is this just passing reference. Paul happens to mention that the stars are not all the same. In fact, there's been arguments still going on about Pluto. There's arguments about what are planets, what are stars, what kind of stars, what their compositions are. Paul happens to mention that. In Job 38, Job describes light as having a source, about having a path. When light has been understood to be simply fixed in place until recently. Job also describes air as having weight. When we would have thought you can't see it, it doesn't have any weight. But of course we've learned since then that air has its own density. You notice that as you climb in altitude, you have less air over your head, the pressure lessens. There is a great weight to our atmosphere or to air. This is interesting. Turn, if you would, to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Most of y'all know that my wife, of course, is from Argentina, so you're all Yankees to her, just so you know. There's an expression in Ecclesiastes that's fascinating. The wind blows in circular patterns. Now, the first time I visited Argentina, there was something that kept bothering me. Now, of course, it's on the other end of the planet. It's in the southern hemisphere. So the first weird part was when you get off the plane, you're in the opposite season. So if you leave here in the wintertime with a heavy coat, you get there in the summertime. In fact, as Christmas rolls around, we have the tradition of Santa wearing a big red coat, and you drink hot chocolate and you sit by the fire. In Argentina, it's a summertime holiday, so Santa's more likely to be at the beach than in a sleigh. Try to wrap your head around that. So the seasons were different, and then I'd walk outside and all the stars were different. I had never seen before the southern constellations. But there was something that kept bugging me, and I'd start my day off and I would be just sort of distracted, like something's off, and I can't figure it out. Finally, I discovered it, and I'd brought a camera, and I took my camera into the bathroom, and I'm taking pictures. And about the time I'm taking pictures, my future mother-in-law walks by and just looks at me. From what I understand, she then walked over to Ruth and said, "Do they not have bathrooms in the U.S.?" But what I was what I was puzzled by, and it took a while for my brain to realize, every morning as I brushed my teeth and watched the sink, it finally dawned on me that the water was swirling the wrong way. Well, or the opposite way. Just things that you grow up with. You may not know the stars very well, but I guarantee you, you're used to kind of where they are. And when that changes, that's different. Ecclesiastes says in chapter 1, as it describes the wind and passing, let's just start with verse 5. He said, also the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again. Blowing toward the south, then turning toward the north, the wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses the wind returns. There's a recognition of the fact, we call it the Coriolis effect, that there's a swirl on both sides of the hemisphere that has to do with the Earth rotating through its atmosphere and the drag of the surface sort of pulling the air around a little bit as it goes around. Again, Ecclesiastes is not talking meteorology, but isn't it interesting when it touches the subject, it's right on the money. Years, centuries, millennia before we would notice that. Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11, God says through his servant Moses that the life is in the blood. We didn't figure that out either until recently. As I understand it, the reason that the barber pole has a red stripe around it is you could not only get your hair cut, but you could get bled if you needed it. Now, some barbers still do that today, but I don't think on purpose. All right? But the idea was that you could build up too much blood and you had to let some of it off. History says that's probably why George Washington died. It was common when you were ill, especially with the fever, that they would bleed you. And it was kind of a cool technique. They could either open a vein or just put some leeches on you. I mean, that's healthy, right? Well, imagine having a fever, which often is a result of an infection, and then you get leeches put on you. That's just not a good combination. But again, that's not something that we figured out scientifically or medically until recently. And yet, one of the oldest books in our Bible, written somewhere around 3,500 years ago, Moses says that the blood is the carrier of life, the source of life, that you need it. Now we know in an emergency situation that the first thing you want to do is control bleeding after you check an airway, because if bleeding continues, that's life. There's other things we could look at. Ecclesiastes talks about right here in this same verse, if we were dropped down to verse 7, says, all the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. Isn't it interesting that water continues to run into the ocean? Where does it come from? How are the rivers continually replenished? Well, there's a description not only of conservation of mass and energy in Ecclesiastes, but even the hydraulic water cycle. In other words, the idea that the water runs down the rivers into the ocean, it evaporates out of the ocean, it's carried back by the atmosphere, back over landfall where it precipitates or rains, and then it flows back down to the ocean, and it goes around and around and around. What an interesting thing for the Ecclesiastes writer to just mention in passing. Job 26 verse 7 describes gravity. And then this is probably my favorite. Turn, if you would, to Job chapter 38. Job chapter 38. In the book of Job, there's this amazing conversation that happens. Job suffers greatly, and his question is our question. It seems the number one thing that Job asks is why. Because I don't know about you, but if I can understand the why, I sort of know how to process it. Okay, this has happened because of this. And then I don't have to like it, but at least it makes sense to me. I want things to make sense to me. But so much of what happens in life, I don't know the why. I don't know why did that happen. So as Job has endured these terrible blows, this terrible personal loss of his possessions, of his wealth, of his servants, of his children, of his own health, the thing he seems to be asking is, why has this happened? As you get 3/4 of the way through the book, Job sort of is getting adamant about, I just wished I could talk to God and just ask him. Well, As you get toward the end of the book, God shows up. And he says, I understand you have some questions for me. Sort of paraphrasing. Job's like, and God says, I'll tell you what, paraphrase again. He says, I'll answer your question if you can answer mine. And then he starts asking Job a series of questions. Do you understand this? Do you understand that? Asking him things about creation. Simple things like do you understand why a bird flies? Do you understand why a horse gets excited about battle when other creatures would flee from it? And of course, Job's kind of rocked back on his heels going, I don't know. And the implication seems to be that if we can't understand those simple things, how could we understand the why if God were to tell it to us? Because the tapestry of life, the connectedness of life, of what happens to me today and how I respond to that and how that affects someone else around me and how it affects people in the future. When you think about the web of humanity like a spider web, and you touch one person and the whole web vibrates, all the interconnection. Because in my little world, I'm thinking, how come this happened to me? How come I had to take a right turn when I wanted to take a left turn? Could you imagine if you could get enough altitude to see, well, you took this turn and that brought these opportunities and challenges and that caused these things and that brought this to happen. Can you see that, just how complicated that branches out just in one person's life, but one person touches another person, touches another person. Can you imagine anything more complicated than where humanity is going? And how all of that's influenced and touched? When I ask for my prayer, Lord, please do this, what would be affected if God says yes? What would be affected if God says no? I just can't compute that. And so that's the way that God is going to educate Job is, look, I've got all this. I'm handling all this. And the bottom line seems to be that God is saying just two words. Trust me. Because he's got the birds flying and the sun rising and the wind spinning and this biosphere balanced and crops growing and food being, he's got all of that going on. Maybe he can handle the other stuff too, seems to be the message. But there's this amazing reference, just one of my favorite references. In verse 31, when God is asking Job, do you understand these things? Job 38, verse 31. He says, can you bind the chains of Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth a constellation in its season and guide the bear with her satellites? So he gives this small example, an example of the constellations. But here's what's amazing. According to astronomers, there's only 2 star groups that you can see with the naked eye that are gravitationally bound. What that means is that they're in the gravitational force of each other. They orbit around each other as they're moving through the galaxy. There's 2. This one, Pleiades, and then the second one is the constellation in Orion, specifically in Orion's belt. Here's what's amazing. There's 2 star groups that are gravitationally bound that you can see with the human eye. There are others, but you got to have a telescope. Job may be the oldest written book in the Bible. That it's quite possible and probable that Job was a contemporary with Abraham. That means this statement is 4,000 years old. And there's only 2 star groups, gravitationally bound, that you can see with the human eye, and he happens to mention those 2. Is that a lucky guess or what? Isn't that something? Of all the stars in the constellation, he names the bear. He could have named that one by mistake and said, do you know how I bound them? But he happens to reference the only 2 out of all of these countless stars that are so affected. I think that's amazing. There's other things we could talk about. The Bible talks about how our emotions affect our health. Do you believe that stress can adversely affect your physical health? We're learning about how it can affect your stomach, about how it affects your energy. There's a pretty strong study that is suggesting that our emotional health may even have an impact or influence on diseases even like cancer. The Bible happens to reference contagious diseases by close contact. Have you ever read about how germs were discovered and the idea of cleanliness in surgeries? It is disturbing the way that was discovered, and it had to do with women bearing children, and they started noticing that when doctors and nurses cared for women who were in the throes of some sort of infection, as they cared for them in their delivery and they lost the baby or the mother or both, as they moved on to care for healthy mothers, how they seemed to have trouble too. Just a few years ago, we were visiting a public hospital in Guatemala. And I don't know if you've ever seen anything like that in a country like that, but the church we were visiting had put together care packages and they were delivering them to patients, and they put things in the care package that you couldn't get in the hospital. So when I saw what we were putting in the care packages, I was like, you can't get this in the hospital? It was soap, toothpaste, toothbrushes, toilet paper. We go into the hospital and the patients are on cloth mattresses, not plastic cover, just cloth normal mattresses. If they had any sheets, it's because their family brought them for them. I don't do all that well in those sorts of environments anyway, so I was already on edge, and we came in and there was the infectious disease ward that was right next to the children's ward, and it was separated by a cinder block wall that was that tall. Well, we just recently, in the last couple of centuries, have begun to figure out some ideas about diseases can be contagious. The Bible mentions it a long time ago. It also describes the importance of sanitation as it has to do with health, like doctors learning how to wash their hands when they go from a sick patient to a healthy patient. Those sorts of things that you and I take for granted, and some people carry around their little pump of Purell hand sanitizer. The Bible mentions that a long time ago. So the Bible's not a science book, but when it touches the subject, it's on the money. Centuries and centuries before modern science would discover those things or invent things like telescopes and microscopes to be able to verify. How about historically? Because one of the things the Bible came under attack regularly and still occasionally is that it's not historically accurate. It's kind of made up, it's man's ideas, some myths, some legends mixed up to make a good story. But is it really accurate? I had an interesting conversation this week with one of our members that's a business owner, and they were talking about how it's getting harder and harder because employees are expected to pass background checks. And their record matters, whether they have felonies and misdemeanors. Because if you have someone do work in your home, it's pretty typical that most homeowners want whoever's coming in their home or to be in a school or around children to have a very clean record. So here's the interesting paradox we're in as a culture. We're having these increasingly high standards about background checks and clean records and all that. But how do you teach a lifestyle that would lead to passing background checks? Because we value it in one hand, at least if I want somebody coming in my house, I want to make sure that they check all these lists. At the same time, our society says, but I don't want you teaching me any sort of ethics from any biblical standard. How do you not have one, but have the other? So the Bible's not a science book. It's really not a history book. Now, it talks a lot about people and about the past, but its purpose is to teach us how to live, to show us who God is and who we are to Him. So occasionally there'll be people that will talk about the Bible, how it's got some made up stuff in it. Well, one example would be the Hittites. The Bible talks a lot in the Old Testament about the Hittites. They were a constant struggle with Israel. Well, by the time you get to the early 1900s, there had been no evidence or reference to Hittites. And so people are starting to say there never were, that's just made up. Maybe it's all sort of allegorical, it's kind of a story, but it's not rooted in reality. And so some folks got shovels, and the modern science of archaeology was birthed out of some trying to disprove the Bible and some trying to prove the Bible. And sure enough, in about 1901 or so, they're digging along and the shovel goes clink and they start finding some ruins, and they discover not just the Hittites, but they actually find the ancient capital of the Hittite nation. And they find references to folks and events that were named in the Bible. When Luke in the book of Acts calls Gamaliel a proconsul, when he mentions the proconsul in one of Paul's journeys, one of the criticisms was nobody's ever used that title in the Roman Empire. And then they found an arch stone that had that title inscribed on it. Because one of the bad habits I have, and I think we all have, if I haven't heard of it, it doesn't exist. I told you that little story that when I grew up in Idaho and then Dad and his ministry, we moved to Missouri. When I would tell my little buddies in elementary school about winters that get 40 below zero, do you know what the Missourians said? They called me a fibber. They said, everybody knows it doesn't get that cold. Well, we stayed there a few years. We moved back to Idaho. I told my buddies in elementary, you can't believe that it gets 112 in the summertime. You know what the Idahoan elementary kids said? Everybody knows it doesn't get that hot. You're a liar. If I don't know it, it must not exist. There's sort of an inborn arrogance to the way we process information. In the same way, there's a criticism. The Bible talks in the book of Daniel about the king Belshazzar. And nobody had heard of him. In fact, the historical records we had said never was a king with that name. And so that's discredited. Well, if that's not true, then is the lion's den true? And that's a fair question. So there began to be a criticism that's not really historically accurate. And then in about 1956, there was a discovery of the ancient writings on stone that found out that there was a king had gone off to battle, and while he was gone, he put his son on the throne in his place to hold his position, and his son was named Belshazzar. Let's talk about prophecy a little bit. We're kind of running out of time. There are over 332 specific prophecies about the Messiah, written hundreds of years before Christ was born. Some describe where he'd be born, what sort of family he'd be born to, how he would die. The book of Isaiah alone, as I mentioned, written 750 years before Christ was born, contains a number of these prophecies. And so there's a fellow that did some math on this, Peter Stoner, about what are the mathematical probabilities, back it up a second, of somebody fulfilling 8 of these prophecies. And he took some ones like being born of a woman. That's good, that's most. Being born of the nation of Israel, tribe of Judah, being born in Bethlehem, children being persecuted at his birth, going off to Egypt. Things that Jesus couldn't go back and do. You know what I mean? Grew up to be an adult, went, oh, here's my checklist. Let me go do those things. They had to have already happened. He had no control over them. They either happened or they didn't. In his study of the math in that the chance of somebody fulfilling 8 of those prophecies is 1 in 10 to the 17th power. Like 17 zeros behind the number 10. And I don't know about you, but I have trouble still seeing that number and understanding how big that is. He goes on to say, if you had 10 to the 17th power number of silver dollars, you could cover the state of Texas 2 feet deep. Okay, that makes a little more sense to me. I can sort of visualize that. That's the mathematical probability of the fulfillment of just 8 of these prophecies. There's 332 or so of them. In fact, if you just try to fulfill 48 of the 332, the mathematical probability is 1 in 10 to the 157th power. I don't know what that does for you, but I can't picture that either. So the comparison, there's estimated to be 10 to the 66th power number of atoms in the known universe. That's a huge number. And then someone fulfilling 332. So if you were gonna, I'll leave it here for a second. If you could think about the chart of the scientific references the Bible makes, like in Isaiah 40, how the Lord sets above the sphere of the earth, or life is in the blood, or the uniqueness of the 2 gravitationally bound star groups. If you were just going to grade this document on its accuracy, what grade would you give it? So when someone asks me, do I really believe the Bible's the Word of God? My answer is yes. Sometimes people say, well, why do you think that? Well, it's unlike anything I've ever read. And then depending on the conversation or what my favorite example might be, I might mention Job 38 in the 2-star groups, or I might mention Isaiah 40 in the circle of the earth. But this last point for you to think about is simply this. I'll ask people, just read something. Typically I'll steer them maybe to one of the Gospels in Matthew. Just read 2 paragraphs. I don't care, just pick 2 and just read it. Then come talk to me about it. And then when we talk, I'll say, would you mind doing me a favor? Would you read it again and come talk to me about it? And if they're really patient, I'll say, the next time we talk, would you just one more favor? Would you read that one more time and come talk to me about it? Because for me, the most unique thing that I've ever discovered about the Bible is this: you never get finished with it. I like to read recreationally, and I enjoy adventure books. When I was growing up, my mother liked us to read. My dad, of course, was a big reader, is a big reader. And so she had bookshelves, and my dad's books were on the top. Well, to read Dad's books, we had to read through these shelves to get there. And it was pretty motivational. Of course, we were little, and so it was really simple books. And, boy, we'd just read. And I'm not so sure that she didn't keep slipping new books in there, but we would read, and then we got to the Hardy Boys and the adventure set. You know what was on the top shelf when I got there? Louis L'Amour. Right before that was Zane Grey. If you do any Western reading, those are the 2 classics, Zane Grey and Louis L'Amour. And Louis L'Amour's are always great because it was always the same. You open it up and the first page, he was a tall man. And it was hot. You know, I mean, that's kind of where you get with Louis L'Amour. But whether I used to be into Tom Clancy when he was really writing, and those are big old thick books, and I'd have to wait and make sure I had nothing to do the next day, because once I cracked one open, many times I've read straight through the night and had breakfast finishing the book because I just couldn't put it down. So a really good book, I'll read, and I probably read too fast and I miss details because I'm just excited in a hurry to get there. So it's not uncommon for me to read a book again, because I really enjoyed it. Even though I know the ending, you know. I know the boat sinks in the end, but still, I enjoy reading the story. And if it's a really good book, sometimes I'll even read a book 3 times. Just really enjoy it. But here's the difference. After the second reading, the third for sure, nothing surprises me in the book. The boat sinks in the end. But this book says it is the living, breathing Word of God, that it's not just a book. And the most obvious example of that for me, because I can read Louis L'Amour, I can read Tom Clancy, and I enjoy it, and I can learn, I can be challenged. But this book, every single time I read it, I'm surprised. I'll give you an example. I just saw this 2 weeks ago for the first time. Turn, if you would, to Luke chapter 18. Luke 17. It's always been there. The font has not been altered in my Bible. It's always been there. But I was reading along in Luke chapter 17, and Jesus is talking about, in the opening verses, about stumbling blocks, about how inevitable it is that we will stumble, but woe to those who cause stumbling. So you're going to be hurt. That's the nature of humanity, but it's still not okay to hurt someone. And so I'm reading through all that. And he talks about in verse 3 and 4, if somebody asks for forgiveness, you gotta forgive them, even if they sin against you 7 times a day. And I'm thinking, man, that's hard. Ooh, that's hard. I don't like this passage at all. And I'm reading through this, and I can see why in verse 5 the apostles said to the Lord, increase our faith. Because a simple synonym for faith is trust. And the problem with being hurt is I don't trust you now. And to forgive you means I have to risk my heart again, and I don't want to do that. So I can see where they're like, increase our faith. And then the Lord said, if you had faith like a mustard seed, you'd say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. And I've seen that where, wow, if you just have a little bit of trust in God, God's going to come through. He's going to do it. Here's what blew me away. It dawned on me that, I was picturing, you could say to this tree, go from here to there, and a tree gets ripped out of the dirt and thrown into the sea. I mean, that's amazing. That's good enough. But then I don't know. He says, be uprooted and planted in the sea. Planted. Especially if you're talking salt water, but even fresh water, if we took a tree, pulled it out of the dirt, stuck it in the water, it would die. It can't survive there. Salt water especially is toxic. It's poisonous. You can take salt in a hose, put it on your lawn and water that in and kill, make sterile the ground. They're saying, I don't know if we can forgive because it's so hard. People hurt us, and how do we do this? He says, you can be like a tree planted in the sea. How could a tree flourish in a poisonous, toxic environment of salt water? Well, it's not possible, but God could do it. So what Jesus is suggesting, if we can trust God, increase our faith, that He can cause us to flourish in a difficult or toxic environment. I never thought about that. You've probably seen that before. And I don't know how many, I got a grease line in this part of my Bible because I'm there a lot. And there it was. Where's that been? It's not even in pencil on the side. It's always been in there. And that amazes me about the Bible. We get to talk some more about some of the big questions. We talked about, is God real? We've talked about the Bible. And then we're going to move to talk about some of the application about what's next in life's big questions. And so I invite you and encourage you to continue to join us.